The letters fell out of the saddlebag like a confession. Ella Collins stood in the middle of August Warren's bedroom, her hands trembling, her breath gone from her chest entirely. There had to be 30 of them, maybe more, folded carefully, creased along the edges with the kind of deliberate precision that spoke of someone who had handled each one many times. Her own handwriting stared back at her from every single envelope. Her own name, written in her own careful script, addressed to people back home in Missouri. Letters she had written and left on the front porch of the Warren Ranch house, letters she had trusted to the mail rider, letters she had believed were carried east across the plains and over the rivers to the people she loved. None of them had ever been sent. Every single letter she had written in the 14 months since arriving in Redemption Creek, Texas, was right here. Hidden beneath a false bottom in August Warren's saddlebag, tucked inside a leather pouch that had been stitched closed and then carefully reopened and stitched again, over and over, as though the man had been checking on them, tending to them, as though they were something precious rather than something stolen. The worst part was not the betrayal of it. The worst part was not the dark fury rising in her chest or the hot sting behind her eyes. The worst part was the ribbon. Someone had tied a thin strip of blue ribbon around the entire bundle. Not roughly, not carelessly, the way a man tosses aside something he wants to hide and forget. It was tied in a bow. The same blue as the dress she had been wearing the first day she arrived at Redemption Creek. The same blue as the ribbon she had woven through her hair that morning 14 months ago, when she stepped off the stage with her trunk and her basket and her terrible, stubborn hope. He had saved the ribbon. August Warren, the man who had barely spoken 10 words to her in the past month. August Warren, who ate his meals in silence and answered her questions with single syllables and who had, just this morning, walked past her in the yard without so much as turning his head. Cold, distant, unreachable. She had told herself 100 times that she had done something wrong, that she had somehow offended him, that the quiet and rigid rancher simply did not want her here and was too proud to say so. But a cold man did not tie a ribbon around stolen letters. A cold man did not keep every single word you had ever written, folded and cherished inside the one thing he carried everywhere he went. Ella sat down hard on the edge of his bed, the letters fanned across her lap, and tried to remember how she had come to be in this place at all. It had started the way most things started in 1874, with a notice in the newspaper. The Missouri Gazette had printed the advertisement on a Thursday in April, tucked between a notice about a lost bay mare and a column on the increasing unrest along the Kansas border. It was not remarkable in its language, which was perhaps what made Ella stop and read it twice. Most of the marriage advertisements she had seen were boastful or pathetically desperate, men describing their acreages in the same breath as they described their loneliness. This one said only this: rancher in Redemption Creek, Texas, honest work, good land, looking for a woman of sense and courage. No promises of luxury, honest life offered in return for honest partnership. Inquire to August Warren, Box 4, Redemption Creek, Cook County, Texas. Ella had been 23 years old and living in her older brother Gerald's house, helping his wife Martha with the children and the cooking, and the endless work of a farm that barely produced enough to keep 6 people fed through winter. She was not unhappy exactly, but she had begun to feel the particular quiet desperation of a woman who could see her whole life already written out in front of her with no room left to change a single word. She had written back to August Warren not because she was romantic or reckless, but because something in the plain directness of his words felt like a hand reaching through the paper. She had written a letter, then another, then another. His replies had taken 3 weeks each way. They were short at first, shorter than hers by a significant measure, but they were never dismissive. He answered her questions directly. He told her that Redemption Creek had a church and a general store and a doctor who came through every 6 weeks, and that the nearest proper town was Gainesville, a day's ride south. He told her his ranch was called the Double W, and that he had built the main house himself 12 years ago with help from two of his hands, a man named Calhoun and a man named Prentice, both of whom were still working for him. He told her that his mother had died of fever the previous winter, and that his father had been dead for 9 years. He did not tell her how old he was until she asked directly, and then he said 29, which was 6 years older than her and nothing alarming. He never once described himself as lonely. That was the thing that kept pulling her back to his letters. Every other man she had ever read about in those notices was drowning in loneliness and waving his arms for rescue. August Warren wrote as though he were presenting terms of a business agreement that he believed to be fair and wanted to be fully understood before either party committed. There was no performance of sentiment in his words, but there was an underlying current of something she could only call care. He wanted her to know exactly what she was agreeing to. He did not want to deceive her. She had thought that meant he was honest. She had not anticipated that honest and hidden could exist in the same man. By late July of 1873, 6 letters in on each side, they had come to an agreement. She would come to Redemption Creek and they would meet properly, and if they were both willing, the marriage would proceed. If not, he had written in his clear, even hand, she would have sufficient funds to return to Missouri and no shame attached on his side. She had packed her trunk, kissed Gerald and Martha and the children goodbye, and stepped aboard the stage to Texas with her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. The journey took 11 days. Redemption Creek in August of 1873 was a town of perhaps 300 people, situated on the edge of the Red River Valley where the land began its long, flat argument with the sky. There was a main street of bare-packed earth, a saloon, a general store run by a man named Dorset, a church with a white-painted door, a livery, a blacksmith, and a post office the size of a garden shed. Everything was sun-bleached and purposeful, the way places are when beauty is considered an unaffordable luxury. August Warren had been standing by the stage stop when she arrived. She had known him immediately, which surprised her. She had not expected to be able to pick him out of a crowd, but there was nobody else on the street who stood the way he stood, perfectly still, with his hat held at his side and his eyes on the arriving stage. He was taller than she had pictured from his letters, broad across the shoulders in the way of men who have spent years building things with their hands. His hair was dark, nearly black, and his face was the kind that sun and weather work into strong, clean lines. He was, in the most simple and direct terms, very good-looking, and the realization had flustered her entirely. He had helped her down from the stage without a word and then said, "Miss Collins." "I'm August Warren," as though she might not have guessed. She had laughed. She couldn't help it. The tension of 11 days of traveling broke apart in her chest and she had laughed, and for just a moment she saw something move across his face that might have been the start of a smile before he pressed it back. They had married 3 weeks later. The ceremony was short, performed by the traveling minister who came through Redemption Creek twice a month. Dorset's wife Agnes had pressed the white roses from her garden into a small bouquet and pressed it into Ella's hands that morning without comment, which was about as tender as Agnes Dorset ever got. There had been no wedding feast. August had not kissed her in the church, only pressed his mouth briefly to her cheek in a gesture that felt like a formal acknowledgement of contract, and she had stood there breathing in the smell of him, cedar and horse and the faint bite of lye soap, and told herself that this was fine. That warmth would come. The warmth had not come. Or rather, it had come in small, confusing fragments that she could never assemble into a clear picture. There were evenings when she would look up from her sewing to find him watching her from across the room, with an expression she could not name, one that vanished the moment her eyes met his. There were mornings when she came to the kitchen to find the fire already built and coffee already hot, done before she woke, and she could never tell if that was kindness or simply the habit of a man who rose early. There were nights in their shared bed when she lay awake and felt the careful, deliberate distance he kept between them, and she did not know if she should be hurt by it or grateful for the respect it implied. He was not cruel. He had never once spoken harshly to her, never raised his voice, never treated her with contempt. He simply kept himself at a distance that she could not breach, as though there were a wall made of something invisible between them that she was not allowed to touch. She had tried to breach it. She had tried conversation. She had tried humor. She had tried once, embarrassing herself terribly in memory, reaching across the dinner table to lay her hand over his, and he had looked at her hand on his with an expression so complicated and so quickly shuddered that she had pulled back and pretended she had merely been reaching for the salt. She had started writing letters home in September of 1873, a month after the wedding. Long letters to Gerald and Martha, to her friend Clara Hendricks, who had married a schoolteacher and moved to St. Louis, to her old neighbor Mrs. Perry, who had been kind to her when her mother died. She wrote every 2 weeks, pages of careful description and cheerful determination, painting a picture of the ranch and the town and the life she was building here. She did not write about the loneliness. She did not write about the distance her husband kept from her. She wrote about the beauty of the flat Texas land when the sun went down and the sky went pink and gold, and about the mockingbirds that sang outside the kitchen window, and about the way the Double W's cattle moved across the grass in the late afternoon light like a painting of something magnificent. She had left the first letter on the porch for the mail rider on a Saturday morning. She had watched, in her mind, as he picked it up and carried it north toward Gainesville and the postal route east. She had waited 3 weeks, and when no reply came from Gerald, she had assumed the letter had been slow. She wrote another, then another. When 4 months had passed and not a single reply had arrived, she had written to Gerald in the plainest possible terms. "Are you receiving my letters? Please tell me if you are not. Please send word." No reply. She had asked Dorset at the general store about the reliability of the mail, and he had shrugged his wide shoulders and said it could be unpredictable, but that he hadn't heard of particular trouble on the route. She had asked Calhoun, August's senior hand, who was a man of about 50 with a gray beard and a kind, wrinkled face, whether he knew of anyone else having mail trouble. He had looked at her with an expression she had been unable to interpret at the time, and said he didn't rightly know. She had asked August directly, one evening at dinner, whether he knew if the mail was running properly. He had said, without looking up from his plate, that he believed it was. That had been 8 months ago. She had gone on writing letters that she believed were being sent, gone on waiting for replies that never came, and gone on living beside a man who grew colder and more distant with each passing month until she had arrived at this morning, which was a Monday in early October of 1874, when August had ridden out to the south pasture before dawn and left her in the house alone, and she had noticed that his good saddlebag, the dark brown one with the brass fittings, had fallen from its hook beside the door and split open on the floor. She had picked it up to hang it back, and the false bottom had come loose, and everything she thought she knew about August Warren had scattered across the floorboards like playing cards in a wind. Ella sat on the edge of his bed for a long time. Outside, the Texas morning was bright and pitiless, the sun already high and hot, the mockingbird in the cedar tree going through its entire repertoire without caring at all about the woman inside. The Double W spread out in every direction, 5,000 acres of grassland and river scrub, and somewhere out there August Warren was working with his cattle and his silence and his secrets. She read the letters, all of them. Or rather, she read enough of them to confirm that, yes, these were her letters, unopened, never sent. Her words to Gerald about the way the storms came across the plain from the north, dark and fast as judgment. Her words to Clara about the wedding, written with determined lightness, mentioning that August was kind and capable and that she was sure they would find their footing. Her words to Mrs. Perry about the kitchen garden she was trying to establish, and the difficulty of growing anything in soil that was more sand than earth. Reading them felt like finding her own ghost. She put them back in the bundle, retied the blue ribbon, which she noticed was beginning to fray slightly at the ends from being untied and retied so many times, and placed the bundle gently back inside the saddlebag. She put the saddlebag back on its hook. Then she went outside and sat on the porch step and waited. He came back at midday, riding the big gray horse he called Sergeant, and he saw her on the step from 100 yards out. She could tell by the way he straightened in the saddle. He rode in slowly, unhurried in the visible way that meant the opposite of unhurried, and dismounted at the fence and led Sergeant into the corral with the deliberate attention of a man who needs a moment to think. When he came through the yard gate, she was still sitting on the step. "August," she said. "Ella," he stopped in the middle of the yard. "Something wrong. Your saddlebag fell this morning, the dark one." He went absolutely still. "The bottom came loose," she said. She kept her voice even. She had decided, sitting on the step through the long hot morning, that she was not going to scream at him. She was not going to cry. She was going to ask him the question that needed asking and wait for an answer. "I found the letters." For a long moment August Warren stood in the yard of his own ranch in the October sun and said nothing. His jaw tightened. His hands, hanging at his sides, curled slowly into fists and then opened again. He looked at her and then looked away, out toward the south pasture, as though somewhere out there in the grass was an answer he could bring back. "All of them," she said. "Every letter I wrote. 14 months of letters, tied up with a ribbon." He took off his hat. He pressed his hand through his hair. He put his hat back on. "August," she said, and her voice cracked just slightly on the second syllable of his name, despite everything she had decided. "Why?" He did not answer immediately, and she thought for a terrible moment that he was not going to answer at all, that he was simply going to walk past her into the house and leave the question hanging in the air between them like all the other words they had never said. But he did not walk past her. He came and he sat down on the step beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him from the long morning in the sun, and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his hat in his hands, and he stared out at the road. "Should have sent them," he said. "Yes," she said, "you should have. I know," his voice was low and careful. "I know what that sounds like. I know what it looks like. I know there isn't an explanation that makes it right." "I'm not looking for right," she said. "I'm looking for true." He was quiet again. A long quiet, the kind she had learned over 14 months was not stubbornness, but rather the way his mind worked, slowly and thoroughly, unwilling to speak before it was certain. She had found it maddening. She was finding it maddening now, but she waited. "The first one," he said finally. "I intercepted the first one because I had already read it. Because Calhoun came to me that morning before the mail rider came and he told me that you had left a letter, and I read the address. Gerald Collins, Harmon County, Missouri, and I thought." He stopped. He turned his hat in his hands. "I thought about what you were writing home, and I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid you were writing to tell them it was a mistake," he said. "Afraid you were writing to ask Gerald to come and take you home." She stared at him. "You were afraid I was going to leave." "I know how that sounds." "It sounds like you kept me here against my will," she said. "I kept your letters," he said. "I never kept you. You could have walked to Dorset's store any day and written a letter there and mailed it yourself. You could have asked Calhoun or Prentice to take anything to Gainesville. You could have gotten on the stage any day you wanted to. I never took any of that from you." She thought about that. He was right, technically. He had not locked her in. He had not prevented her from leaving. He had simply intercepted the specific channel she had chosen to use without telling her, and the practical result was that the people she loved had believed she was not writing to them. "Gerald must think I've forgotten him," she said. The realization hit her like cold water. "He must think I've simply gone and started my new life and forgotten my family entirely." August closed his eyes briefly. "I thought about that too. After the third one." He paused. "After the third one I should have sent them. I know I should have. But by then I had already kept the first two, and sending the third seemed like it would require explaining why the first two hadn't arrived, and I didn't have any explanation that I was willing to put in front of you. So you kept keeping them." "So I kept keeping them." "And the ribbon," she said. He was quiet for a moment that had a different quality from his other silences, a raw quality. The ribbon was from your hair, he said. The day you arrived. It came loose from your braid when you stepped down from the stage. I caught it. He turned his hat another quarter turn. You didn't notice. I put it in my pocket and I can't tell you exactly why except that you had just laughed and your face looked like something I hadn't seen in a long time and I didn't want to lose the evidence of it. Ella pressed her hand over her mouth. She did not cry. She had decided. You kept it, she said. For 14 months you kept a ribbon from my hair. And every word you ever wrote, he said, so quietly she almost didn't catch it over the wind coming across the yard. She stood up. She needed to stand up, needed to move, because staying still with all of this pressing in on her from every direction was beyond her capacity. She walked to the fence and put her hands on the top rail and looked out at the land, the endless, beautiful, punishing land that she had come to love even while she was miserable. I need you to explain something to me, she said without turning around. I need you to explain the distance, the silence. Because here is what I have lived with for 14 months, August. I have lived with a man who watches me when he thinks I'm not looking and then looks away when I turn around. Who keeps every letter I write and ties them up with a ribbon he kept from my hair, and who has not once in 14 months, said anything to me that sounds like he wants me here, who has made me feel every single day like I am a business arrangement he is tolerating rather than a woman he chose. The wind moved through the grass. Behind her she heard him stand. I do want you here, he said. Then why won't you? She turned around. Why won't you let me in? Why won't you talk to me? Why is every conversation like trying to reach through a wall? He was standing in the yard, hat in hand, and the expression on his face was the one she had caught glimpses of before and never understood. It was exposed. It was afraid. On a man who presented himself always as completely composed, it was extraordinary. Because I am not very good at this, he said. At what? At any of it. He pressed his free hand against the back of his neck. At saying things. My father was a man who didn't say things. My mother said everything he didn't say and tried to make up for him, and it didn't work, and she was unhappy for 30 years trying. I grew up in a house where words were either weapons or they were absent, and I learned not to use them. He stopped. That is not an excuse, I know it isn't. I'm not asking for an excuse, she said. I'm asking for an explanation because those are different. I'm terrified, he said, the word hung between them. Of what, she asked. Of being the reason you're unhappy, he said. Of opening my mouth and saying the wrong thing and losing what little. He stopped again, and this time the pause had the quality of a man who has gone too far to go back. What little I have of you. She looked at him across the yard. The man who had built this house with his own hands and kept her letters and tied them with a ribbon and sat down on her step today rather than walking past her. The man who stood now in the October sunlight with his hat in his hands and his defenses finally, visibly, stripped away. August, she said, what do you want from me? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said everything. Ella walked across the yard toward him. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough to see that the line of his jaw was tight and that he was breathing carefully, with the controlled steadiness of a man bracing himself. Close enough to smell cedar and horse and sun-warm cotton. That is the first honest thing you have said to me out loud since we got married, she said. I know. Say another one. He looked down at her. The wall, the invisible barrier she had spent 14 months unable to breach, was not gone, but there was a door in it now and he had opened it and she could see through to the other side. I think about you constantly, he said, every hour of every day. When I'm out on the range, I think about what you said at breakfast or what you're doing in the kitchen, and whether the mockingbird is singing because you were talking to it. When I come in at night and the lamp is lit in the window, I feel something that I don't have a word for except that it is the opposite of everything this house felt like before you came. He exhaled. I thought those things would be obvious. I thought a man who kept every word you ever wrote was saying something clear. A man who hides every word I ever wrote is saying something else entirely, she said. He is saying that his own comfort matters more than my freedom. August flinched. It was small, barely visible, but it was there. Yes, he said, that is also true. So you are both of those things at once, she said. A man who loves too much and keeps too tight a grip. I suppose I am. She reached up and took the hat out of his hands. She set it on the fence post beside them. Then she took one of his hands in both of hers, the way she had wanted to do for 14 months, the way she had tried once and been too frightened by his reaction to try again. He looked down at their hands with the same complicated expression, but this time he did not shut it away. "The letters are going to be sent," she said. "All of them. Tomorrow I'm going to Gainesville with Calhoun, and I am going to post every single one of them. And I am going to write a new letter to Gerald explaining that there was a mail problem and that I am well and that I would very much like him and Martha to write back." "All right," he said. "And we are going to talk," she said. "Every day. Even when it is hard. Even when you would rather be quiet. We are going to find a way to be in the same room without you watching me like something you're afraid to touch." "All right," he said again, and this time the corner of his mouth moved just slightly. "I am not going to leave," she said. "I want that understood. I was never writing to Gerald to ask him to come get me. I was writing to him because I missed him and because I needed someone to know who I was before I came here. Do you understand that?" "I understand it now," he said. "I didn't understand it then. I was a fool." "You were," she agreed. "But you were also a fool who kept my ribbon." Something broke open in his expression. Not the controlled, careful breaking that she had watched him do before, where he allowed a small piece through and then closed everything else down. Something real and wide, like a door blown off its hinges by a strong wind. "Ella," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm sorry." She looked up at him. His eyes were dark and very direct, and she thought about all the evenings she had felt them on her and turned to find him looking away. And she thought about how terrifying it must have been for a man like this, who had been taught that words were dangerous, to feel this much and have no tools to carry it. She did not excuse it. She was not going to excuse it today, and perhaps not for some days yet. The hurt of it was real, the isolation of 14 months without her family's voices in any form, the small private grief of letters that reached no one. But she held his hand. "I know you are," she said. The afternoon went gently after that, which seemed wrong given the enormity of the morning. But perhaps it was simply that they were both exhausted by the weight of what had been laid down between them. She made coffee and he sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time in their marriage, he told her about the double W, not the practical version she already knew, the acreage and the cattle count and the plans for expanding the south pasture. The real version. He told her that his father, Thomas Warren, had won the land in a card game in 1851, and that Thomas Warren had been a man of great appetites and very little patience, who had built the ranch on the labor of men he underpaid, and through deals that August, even as a child, had suspected were not entirely honest. He told her that his mother, a woman named Caroline, had grown up in Virginia and had come west with Thomas following the bright promise of the man he had been before the land, and the money started doing things to him, and that Caroline had spent the last 15 years of her life in a house where her husband was often away and often wrong and rarely kind. He told her that he had sworn, watching his parents, that he would never be Thomas Warren, that he would be fair, that he would be honest, that he would not perform sentiment he didn't feel just to smooth things over. He had been so focused on not being his father that he had overcorrected entirely in the other direction and become a man who performed nothing, not even the sentiment he genuinely felt. "I always thought," he said, looking at the coffee in his cup, "that people could see through the surface of things. That if I kept your ribbon and got up early to make the fire and made sure the house was always warm, you would simply know what that meant." "People can't see through surfaces," Ella said. "That's why we have words." "I know that," he said. "Intellectually, I know that. The practice is harder." "Then we will practice," she said. He looked up at her. "I will ask you questions," she said, "and you will answer them. Not because I am prying, but because I want to know you. And you can ask me questions too, because I think you don't know me nearly as well as you think you do, and I don't know you nearly as well as I need to, and that is going to change." "Starting now," he said. "Starting now," she said. The questions started slowly, the way careful things do when there is still tenderness around the edges. She asked him about the South pasture expansion, and he answered. And then she asked what had made him decide on cattle rather than horses, and he told her. And then she asked about the hands, Calhoun and Prentice, and he talked about them with an unguarded warmth that she had never heard in his voice before, telling her about the time Calhoun had talked a horse out of a ravine by singing hymns to it for 2 hours. And she laughed, and he smiled, and the kitchen felt like a different room than it had yesterday. She asked about his mother's death. The smile faded, but he didn't retreat behind the wall. He said it had been a fast fever in January, that Caroline had been sick 3 days and gone on the 4th, and that the worst of it was not the loss itself, but the way she had looked at him in her last hours with an expression that he could only interpret as relief, as though she were finally, after all those years, being allowed to set something down. "I don't want anyone to feel relief when I'm gone," he said. "I want to be the kind of person people grieve." "You will be," Ella said quietly. "But you have to let them know you first." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What about you? What made you answer my advertisement when you'd never answered one before?" She raised an eyebrow. "How do you know I'd never answered one before?" "Because you wrote to me about it," he said. "In your 4th letter, you said you'd read a dozen such advertisements over the years and thrown them all away, and mine was the first one you kept." She stared at him. "You have read my letters to Gerald." He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I have read all of them. All 30 of them. Closer to 32. I may have read each one more than once." She put her head in her hands. She did not know whether to laugh or weep. "You know everything I've been thinking for 14 months. I know everything you thought was safe to put on paper," he said. "I am aware that is an invasion. I am aware that is a separate wrong from keeping them." She looked at him from between her fingers. "You are going to have a great deal of apologizing ahead of you. I expect so. And a great deal of being talked at. I expect that too." She lowered her hands. "You said in your advertisement, honest life for honest partnership. That is still what I want, both parts of it. Honesty from you, including the honesty of your feelings and genuine partnership, which means I am a full person here with the right to communicate with my own family and make my own decisions." "Yes," he said, "those are not negotiable." "I know," he said. "They never should have been." She stood up and began to clear the coffee cups, and he stood too, and he took the cups from her hands, not roughly, very gently, and set them in the wash basin and began to wash them, which was such an unexpected small gesture that she stood and watched him do it. "I used to watch my mother do this every day," he said, his back to her, hands in the water. "I thought someday I would help." She came and stood beside him and picked up the cloth to dry the cups as he washed them, and they stood at the basin together in the late afternoon light streaming through the kitchen window, not speaking, and it was the most intimate thing that had ever happened in that house. The next morning Ella rode to Gainesville with Calhoun. The older man was quiet on the long ride south, but comfortably quiet, the way Calhoun always was. He was a weathered, practical man who had been on the Double W for 11 years and who, Ella had always suspected, was more observant of the goings-on in that household than he ever let on. She thought about asking him directly whether he had known about the letters. She decided to ask. "Calhoun," she said, about 2 hours into the ride, with Gainesville's water tower just visible on the horizon, "did August ask you not to take mail for me to town?" Calhoun rode in silence for a moment. Then he said, "He asked me not to mention it if you asked, but you're asking direct." "I am asking very direct." He exhaled through his nose. "He asked me to route your letters through him, said he'd handle the mailing. In the beginning I thought that's what he was doing. By the time I figured out he wasn't, I'd already been quiet about it too long to speak up comfortable." He glanced at her. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Warren, that was wrong of me." "It was," she said, "but I appreciate the honesty now." "He's not a bad man," Calhoun said, "in case you need to hear that from someone who's known him longer than you have." "I don't think he's a bad man," she said. "I think he's a very frightened one who made a very bad choice." "That's him exactly," Calhoun said. "That's about the most accurate description of August Warren I've ever heard." In Gainesville, she posted every one of the 32 letters. She paid the postmaster herself, from the small amount of spending money she had saved from the household account. She also wrote a new letter to Gerald, 4 pages long, telling him that there had been a problem with the mail, that it had been resolved, that she was well, and that the W was a fine place, and that she hoped he and Martha and the children would write back as soon as they received this letter. She did not explain what the mail problem had been. That was between her and August. When they arrived back at the ranch that evening, August was standing on the porch. Not the casual stand of a man who happened to be outside. He was waiting. He had been waiting. "All sent," he said. "All sent," she said. He nodded. Then he said, "I'd like to write to Gerald myself, if you think he would accept a letter from me." She looked at him. "You want to write to my brother? I want to explain to him that you have been trying to write, and that the fault of it not reaching him was mine and not yours." He held her gaze. "He might think poorly of you for not writing. I'd rather he think poorly of me for the same reason." She stood on the porch step below him so that they were nearly at eye level, which was unusual, August being as tall as he was. "You're taking responsibility." "It was my responsibility to take." He paused. "I should have done it months ago." She reached up and put her hand flat on his chest over his heart. She felt him go still, the way he always went still at contact, but this time he did not step back. He placed his hand over hers, large and warm and careful. "Write the letter," she said. The weeks that followed were different, not perfect. Not suddenly and magically transformed into the marriage she had dreamed of in Missouri, while reading a plain advertisement in a newspaper. They had 14 months of careful distance between them that needed to be carefully dismantled, and that work was sometimes awkward and sometimes circled back on itself, and sometimes required Ella to repeat herself because August would slip back into silence out of old habit, not from withdrawal but from the ingrained reflexes of a lifetime of keeping things inside. But different, genuinely different. He began to talk at dinner. Small things at first, what had happened in the South pasture, or what Calhoun had said that was funny. But then larger things, stories she had never heard about growing up on the W, about a boyhood that had been lonely in ways that made her chest hurt because she recognized in them the same loneliness she had felt in her first year here. The loneliness of being inside a house with people who were physically present and emotionally absent. He asked her about Missouri. He asked about Gerald and Martha and the children. He asked about her friend Clara and her mother and her father, both of whom had died within a year of each other when she was 19. And she told him things she had only half told him in her letters, because putting them on paper had felt too exposed. She told him about the double grief of it and how Gerald had stepped into the gap, but that Gerald had his own family and his own life, and how she had felt the particular specific loneliness of a woman who belongs to people without quite belonging anywhere. "That was why I answered your advertisement," she said. "Not because I wanted to escape or because I was desperate, because belonging somewhere felt possible when I read what you wrote. No promises of luxury, honest life for honest partnership. That sounded like a place I could actually be myself. And instead I made you feel more alone," he said. "And instead you did," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to spend a long time making that right." "I know," she said, "and I'm going to let you." Gerald's reply came in late November, 5 weeks after Ella had sent the batch of letters. It was a long letter, 5 pages in Gerald's large, uneven handwriting, full of news from Missouri, about the children and the farm and Clara's new baby, but also full of the particular older brother outrage of a man who has been worried for months and is now letting that worry out in relief-flavored anger. He wrote that he was glad she was alive and well, that he had thought more than once of writing to Texas himself to make sure, and that he expected a letter every month from now on without fail. August had written to Gerald a week earlier. Gerald mentioned it at the end of his letter briefly, saying that he had received the note from August Warren and that it had been a straightforward and decent letter that took full responsibility and asked nothing in return, and that Gerald had mixed feelings about it that he was still working through. Ella showed the letter to August. He read Gerald's mention of him carefully. His face was still as he read, but his jaw moved in that way that meant he was feeling something. Mixed feelings, he said. It's Gerald, she said. Mixed feelings today means grudging acceptance by spring. He thinks poorly of me, he said. He's protective of me, she said. That is entirely different. Will he come? She looked at him. The question had a specific quality to it, a vulnerability that he was still learning to let show. Do you want him to? She asked. I want you to have your family here, he said. If that is what you want. She thought about it. Gerald and Martha and the 4 children arriving on the stage, filling this house with noise and commotion. She looked at August's face, at the careful openness there, at the effort it was costing him to put that ahead of his instinct for quiet. Next summer, she said. I'll invite them for next summer. The ranch is more comfortable in summer. He nodded. He folded Gerald's letter and handed it back to her. Then he said, in the careful way he was practicing, I'm glad he wrote back. So am I, she said. December came in cold, colder than the previous year, with a blue norther that swept down from the territories and turned the Red River Valley into something that looked like the edge of the world. The cattle had to be moved closer to the ranch, and Calhoun and Prentice spent most of December in the saddle, and August was out from before dawn until after dark most days, coming in wind-burned and exhausted. On a Sunday evening when the cold had settled in for what felt like permanence, Ella had the fire going in the parlor and a pot of beef stew on the stove and candles lit on the table when August came in. He stopped in the doorway of the parlor and looked at the lit room and then at her, and the expression on his face was the one she now recognized, the one that meant he was feeling something large and had not yet found the words for it. Sit down, she said. You look like you're about to fall over. He sat. She brought him coffee and he drank it without speaking, holding the cup in both hands, and she sat across from him and looked at the fire. Ella, he said. I need to say something. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, his face in profile, sharp and tired and serious. I have been in love with you since about 3 weeks in, he said. Since the day you came out to the North Corral to watch me work with the young horses and you talked to them the whole time, told them what you were seeing, narrated it like you were telling a story. I was working and I was listening to you and I thought, this is the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen in my life, a woman telling horses the story of their own behavior. He paused. And then you laughed at something one of them did and I could not breathe. Ella looked at him. I should have told you then, he said. I should have told you every day after that. Instead, I kept it inside where it just kept getting bigger and heavier until keeping it inside was affecting everything else. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 3 weeks in. About that. And you said nothing for 14 months. I said nothing for 14 months. She stood up and crossed the parlor and she sat down next to him on the settee, very close, and when he turned to look at her, she put her hand on his face. He went very still. His eyes were dark and direct and absolutely unguarded for the first time since she had known him. I think I started falling in love with you much later, she said, probably around the time I found the letters. Something moved in his eyes. That is the most alarming sentence I have ever heard. What I mean, she said, is that before that I was trying to love a wall. After that I could see the man behind it, and the man behind it is someone I would very much like to love properly if he will let me. He covered her hand with his. His other hand came up and he cupped her face very carefully, the way you hold something you have been afraid to touch for too long. He will let you, he said. He kissed her. Not the brief, formal press on the cheek from the wedding morning, but a real kiss, careful at first and then less careful, one hand in her hair and one at her waist, and the fire crackling beside them and the north wind howling outside the window and the whole cold, beautiful, punishing Texas winter pressing against the glass while inside was warm. Christmas came. Ella wrote to Clara, to Mrs. Perry, to Gerald and Martha. She received replies from all of them. Clara sent a drawing her eldest had done of what Missouri looked like in December, bare trees and pale gray sky, and a long letter full of laughter. Mrs. Perry sent a recipe for apple cake that she said had been Ella's mother's recipe originally, which she had gotten from her years ago, and which she thought Ella might like to have. August watched Ella read her letters at the kitchen table and made no attempt to intercept them, and she knew he was making no attempt not because she was watching him but because he had told her he would not and she believed him. Trust was a thing being built, one honest action at a time, and she was watching it go up. On Christmas morning he gave her a present. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, and she opened it at the table and it was a book. A collection of poetry by John Keats, worn at the spine and soft in the pages, clearly read many times. "This was my mother's," he said. "She used to read from it in the evenings." Ella held the book very carefully. "August, I thought you might like something to read in the evenings," he said. "Something that wasn't a letter." She opened it. On the flyleaf, in a fine hand that was not his, Caroline Warren, 1849, Virginia. Below it, in August's clear, even script, "For Ella, who makes this house what it was always supposed to be." She looked up at him with full eyes. "Too much," he said, and she could hear the trace of uncertainty in it that she was coming to love. "Not enough," she said. She got up and kissed him over the table, and the coffee went cold, and neither of them noticed. January was hard but close. The cold kept them inside more than usual, and they learned each other's daily rhythms and preferences in the way that married people do when they are actually paying attention. She learned that he woke at 4:30 and needed half an hour of silence with his coffee before he was ready to speak, and she began setting the coffee before she went back to sleep so that it was ready when he came down, and he began leaving her coffee warm on the back of the stove for when she rose at 7. She learned that he read in the evenings if she was sewing, and that he preferred to read out loud if she would listen, which she would. And the evenings in January were long and lit by firelight and full of whatever he was reading, histories mostly, and once a book about the land formations of the American Southwest that she found inexplicably fascinating. He learned that she talked to herself when she was thinking hard about something, whole conversations with absent people, and instead of finding it strange, he started asking her about what she was working through, and she started talking to him instead of the walls. He learned that she had a temper that came on fast and hot and burned out quickly, and that the worst thing to do when she was in it was to go quiet, because she experienced silence as dismissal. He practiced staying in the room and saying something, even if it was only, "I hear you," and the first time he did it, she was so surprised that her temper went out like a candle in a draught, and she stared at him. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, the kind that left him sitting up in the gray before dawn, rigid and silent, and that he would not speak about them but that he would accept her hand in his, and that seemed to help. February brought a brief warm spell that felt like a promise and then reneged on it, but there were 3 days mid-month when the sky went soft and blue and everything smelled like wet grass and possibility. On the second of those days, Ella went out to the corral with 2 of the young horses that had been brought in over winter, and August came and leaned on the fence rail and watched her talk to them. She was aware of him watching. She talked to the horses anyway. "You are very beautiful," he said. She looked at him over the back of the bay filly. "I thought you didn't say things like that." "I'm practicing," he said. She laughed. The filly twitched at the sound. "I know you are. And I think you are very handsome, for the record." "For the record," he repeated, with the slight edge of amusement she was increasingly delighted to find in him. "I should have told you earlier," she said. "I thought you would find it presumptuous." "I would have been too flustered to respond properly," he admitted. "But I would have liked it." She came around the fence and stood next to him at the rail. He put his arm around her, which was still new enough to make her lean into it. "I want this to last," she said. "It will," he said. "You don't know that." "I know it the way I know the land," he said. "The way I know the grass will come back every spring." "Some things you know because you've watched them long enough to trust the pattern." "That is almost poetry," she said. "Don't tell anyone," he said. "I have a reputation." She laughed again, and he pulled her closer, and they stood at the fence in the February sun while the horses moved behind them and the land stretched out in every direction, immense and patient and lit up like a promise kept. Spring came properly in late March, and with spring came the full weight of the working season. The Double W expanded its herd with cattle from a ranch to the east that was selling off, and August hired 2 additional hands, a young man named Webb who was 20 and eager, and reminded Ella slightly of a retriever puppy, and a quiet, serious man named Acosta, who turned out to be from a family that had been on this land for 3 generations before Texas was Texas, and who knew the lay of the soil better than anyone. Ella liked them both. The Double W began to feel, for the first time, like something more than just a ranch. It felt like a place with people in it. In April, she planted her kitchen garden. The soil was still difficult, more sand than good black earth, but she had been composting through the winter, and she had learned from the previous failed attempts what would grow here and what wouldn't, and she planted tomatoes and beans and squash, and the herbs she had been growing in pots in the kitchen window all winter. Acosta watched her work one morning, and then without comment got a shovel and showed her a technique for mounding the soil that he said his grandmother had used, and the garden that spring was the best she had ever grown anywhere. She wrote to Gerald about it. She wrote to Martha separately about the specific challenges of growing food in a dry Texas summer. Martha wrote back with suggestions from her own kitchen garden in Missouri, and between the two of them they conducted a kind of agricultural correspondence that became one of Ella's great pleasures of that year. In May, Gerald wrote to say that he and Martha were planning to come in July. August read the letter when she showed it to him, and she watched his face for the tightening she might have expected from a man who had spent his life keeping people at a careful distance. She saw it, a small movement in his jaw, and then she watched him consciously set it aside. "July is good," he said. "The house can manage 5 extra people." "6," she said. "The baby will be walking by then." "That is 6 people counting the baby." "6," he amended. "We'll put Gerald and Martha in the front bedroom and the children on the floor in the parlor." She looked at him steadily. "You have already thought about this." "I may have considered the logistics," he said. "You are trying," she said. He met her eyes. "I told you I was going to spend a long time making things right," he said. "I meant it." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand and held hers, easy and natural now, the gesture that had once been impossible between them. She was in love with him, fully, properly, without reservation. She had known it for a while, but she was still occasionally surprised by the depth of it, by the way the ordinary moments hit her with extraordinary force, the way he looked reading by the fire, the way he always made the coffee, the way he had, apparently, saved her ribbon. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "The letters," she said. "What you did, keeping them, I've forgiven it. I want you to know that. I'm not bringing it up to relitigate it." He nodded, watching her carefully. "I want to keep them," she said. "Not hidden, not in a saddlebag. I want to put them in a box on the shelf where I can see them if I want to, because they are a record of my first year here, and that year was also real and also mine, even the hard parts." He was quiet for a moment. "They're yours," he said. "They were always yours." She nodded. "And the ribbon," a pause. "What about it?" "I want it back," she said, "but not from the saddlebag." She looked at him. "I want you to give it to me properly, as a thing you were keeping." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he got up from the table and went to the bedroom. She heard the saddlebag, which still hung by the door though its secret was long gone, and then he came back to the kitchen and he set the blue ribbon on the table in front of her. She picked it up. It was more worn than she remembered, soft with handling. She turned it in her fingers. "You have touched this a great deal," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked up at him. "Come here," she said. He came around the table and she stood and she took the ribbon and wound it around their joined hands twice, the way she had seen it done at some weddings in Missouri, and she held his gaze and she said, "I am choosing to be here, August. Every day I am choosing it. I want you to know that." Something in him that had been held carefully for a very long time went completely quiet, the way water goes still. "So am I," he said. Gerald and Martha arrived on a hot Thursday afternoon in July, stepping off the stage with 4 children ages 2 to 10 and enough luggage for a month, which they were planning on staying for 2 weeks. Gerald Collins was a big, fair-haired man with the same blue eyes as Ella and the same quick laugh, and he shook August's hand with the careful assessment of a man deciding what he thinks of another man, and not yet being entirely sure. Martha was warm and practical and immediately useful, setting the 2 older children to helping with the luggage, and walking the baby between her hip and Ella's kitchen, in the manner of a woman who has never once in her life stood still when she could be doing something. The first evening was slightly stiff, with Gerald and August navigating the particular awkwardness of men who are meeting properly for the first time with a complicated history between them. Ella watched it over the dinner table and resisted the impulse to help it along, because she had learned that some negotiations between men had to happen in their own time, and any assistance was interference. By the second day, things had shifted. August took Gerald out to the south pasture in the morning to look at the cattle operation, the expansion, the new grazing rotation he was trialing, and something happened out there on the land with the horses and the grass and the wide Texas sky, the way it does with men who share a commitment to hard work and honest doing, and they came back at noon different. Still careful, still in the early stages of deciding what they thought of each other, but something had cracked open. Gerald said to Ella quietly while August was washing up, "He's a good man with the land." "He is," she said. "He wrote me a decent letter." "I know." "That doesn't mean," Gerald started again. "I'm not entirely there yet." "You don't need to be," she said. "There is time." He looked at her, the older brother look she had known her whole life. "You're happy," he said. "You actually are." "I actually am," she said. "All right then," he said. By the end of the 2 weeks, Gerald had spent 2 days working cattle with August and Calhoun, which appeared to have been the definitive test, because on the evening before they left, he shook August's hand again, longer this time, and said something low that Ella couldn't hear, and August nodded and they were square. Martha, for her part, had formed her own opinion several days earlier and spent the last week of the visit writing out recipes for Ella and talking with a frankness about marriage and household and the particular negotiations of daily life that Ella had been missing desperately without quite realizing it. She sent her off with a hug that lasted a long time. "Write every 2 weeks, Martha said. "I mean it." "Every 2 weeks," Ella said. "Without fail." She watched the stage until it was dusk on the southern horizon, and then she stood in the road a moment longer just to feel the particular bittersweetness of it. The missing and the staying. The way home had started to mean 2 things at once. August came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything, which was right. After a while, she took his hand and they walked back to the ranch. In September, she told him she thought she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast, which in retrospect she might have done differently, but she had been carrying the knowledge for 3 weeks and the suspense of keeping it had finally overwhelmed her caution. She simply said it over the eggs. "I think we're going to have a baby. In the spring, I think." August put down his fork. He sat very still for a long moment, in the way she now knew was not blankness but processing. She waited. When he looked up at her, his expression was one she had never seen on him before. It was completely, absolutely unguarded, as open as a window thrown wide, and what was on the other side of it was enormous and bright. "Spring," he said. "April, I think. I'm not certain of the timing." He stood up from the table. He came around and he pulled her up and held her with the kind of care people use for things that are precious and fragile, though she was neither fragile nor required to be, but she understood the impulse and she let herself be held. "We need the doctor," he said into her hair. "The doctor comes through in October," she said. "I'll see him then." "Is October soon enough?" "October is soon enough," she said. He held her longer. "August," she said. "Yes." "I'm going to need you to breathe," he exhaled. She felt it through the whole of him, Then he laughed, which was still sufficiently rare that it hit her somewhere behind the sternum when it happened. "I'm breathing," he said. "Good," she said. "Keep doing that." The doctor confirmed the pregnancy in October and said April was his best estimate for the due date, and that everything appeared healthy and normal, and that Mrs. Warren should continue eating well and continue her outdoor work within reason, and not ride horses after January if she could help it. August was present for the entire appointment, which the doctor appeared to find faintly amusing, and he asked twice the same question about whether Ella's headaches, which were mild and occasional, were a concern, and the doctor answered patiently both times. After the doctor left, August sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and the particular stillness that had come to mean that he had something to say and was working up to it. She waited. "I want to be a different kind of father than mine was," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm going to need you to tell me when I'm doing it wrong," he said. "When I'm retreating, when I'm going silent when I should be present. Because I will probably at times when the fear gets bigger than my good sense. I'll tell you," she said, "and you'll listen." "I'll listen," he said. She sat across from him. "Do you want a boy or a girl?" He thought about it seriously, which was one of the things she loved about him, the seriousness with which he considered even the simple questions. "I want healthy," he said. "After that I don't have a preference." "I think it's a boy," she said. "I don't know why, I just think it." He looked at her with the quiet amusement that had become one of her favorite things in the world. "On what basis?" "Instinct," she said grandly. "That is not a basis." "It is the only basis available to me at this juncture," she said, "and I am committed to it." He smiled. The full one, not the controlled partial smile that was all he had offered for the first 14 months. The real one which reached his eyes and changed his whole face and still, after nearly a year of seeing it more regularly, made her heart do something unreasonable. Winter came gently that year. The norther that had made December brutal in 1874 held off until late January in 1875, and by then they were deep into the waiting of the pregnancy, the long, slow time of preparation that is also a kind of becoming. Ella was well, energetic in a way that she hadn't expected, and the doctor had said was a good sign, and she spent the cooler months of the winter making the household ready. She wrote to Martha asking for advice about what to prepare. She wrote to Clara, who had 2 children and was expecting a third. She wrote to Mrs. Perry, who had raised 7. The replies that came back were practical and warm and various, a collective wisdom from women across a distance, and she read each one to August in the evenings by the fire, and he listened with the focused attention of a man studying something he is determined to understand. He built a cradle. He built it himself, in the barn through December and January, in the evenings after the work was done, and she found out about it from Webb, who mentioned it in passing, and then went red with the embarrassment of having told her what he suspected was a surprise. She didn't let on that she knew. She let August carry the cradle in one February morning with the careful pride of a man presenting something he has made entirely by hand, and she looked at it with appropriate amazement, which was actually not difficult to fake because it was genuinely beautiful, solid cedar with smoothed edges and a small carved W on the headboard. "That took you all winter," she said. "Most of it," he said. She ran her hand along the edge of it. "Our baby is going to sleep in something you made." He looked at her. "That was the idea." She looked up at him. "I love you," she said. It was not the first time she had said it, but it was one of the times that mattered, the kind of declaration that comes up from somewhere real and lands somewhere real. "I love you," he said back, without a beat of delay, in the direct way he had found for saying the things that mattered. April came in warm and fast. On a clear Tuesday morning, the 10th of April, 1875, Ella and August Warren's son was born in the bedroom of the Double W Ranch house, attended by the local doctor and Agnes Dorset, who turned out to be surprisingly capable in a crisis situation, and who kept Ella calm through the long hours of it with a flat, practical narration that was more comforting than any amount of soft cooing would have been. August waited outside the bedroom door for 6 hours and would not sit down, a fact which Calhoun, who was waiting on the porch, found both entirely expected and a little exhausting. When the baby cried, the sound of it came through the closed door, and August Warren put his hand flat on the door and stood there for a moment with his eyes closed. When the doctor came out and said it was a healthy boy and that Ella was well and that he could go in, August went in. She was sitting up against the pillows, tired in a way that was deeper than any tiredness he had seen on her, and she had their son in her arms, small and red-faced and insistently alive, and she looked up when August came through the door. "Come see him," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed very carefully and looked at the baby, and Ella watched his face. He did not retreat behind the wall. He did not go still in the way of a man processing something he needs time for. He simply looked at his son, and his expression was open and undisguised and wholly his. And then he looked at Ella, and the expression did not change, it deepened. And he reached over and tucked her hair back from her face with one hand in a gesture so purely tender that she had to blink several times. "Thomas," he said. It was the name they had discussed. His father's name, which he had decided he wanted to reclaim from the failure his father had made of it. "Thomas," she agreed. "Tom," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, trying it out. "Tom," she said. The baby made a sound. August reached out and put one finger into the baby's fist, and the tiny fingers closed around it with the reflexive grip of the newborn. And August Warren, who had spent a lifetime keeping grip on very little, held still and let his son hold on. Gerald and Martha came for a week in June to meet the baby, and Gerald held Tom with the practiced ease of a man who had held 4 of his own, and declared him perfect, which Tom accepted with the total indifference of a 2-month-old with more immediate concerns. Martha brought 3 jars of her preserved peaches, which had been a point of discussion in the letters, and Ella ate 1 entire jar in 2 days and felt not the slightest guilt about it. August and Gerald had reached, by this visit, something that looked like genuine respect and the early edges of friendship. They sat together in the evenings, August more talkative than he had been in Gerald's first visit, and they talked about cattle and land, and weather, and eventually about fathers and what they had inherited from them, and what they were trying to do differently. And those were the evenings Ella loved most, sitting with Tom sleeping against her shoulder, and the lamp lit, and the voices of 2 men she loved very much saying true things to each other. The Double W prospered in the following years. The South Pasture expansion doubled the herd by the summer of 1876, and August hired Acosta as a full supervisor rather than a hand, and Acosta took the responsibility with a quiet competence that was deeply satisfying to see. Webb, who had come on as a puppy-eager 20-year-old, turned into a reliable hand, and then into someone August trusted with the kind of decisions that mattered. Calhoun, who was getting older and whose knees troubled him through winter, began to take on less riding and more of the bookkeeping and management work which he was, it turned out, very good at. The ranch became a place with a particular feel to it, not just the Warren land but the Warren place, the kind of operation that people in Redemption Creek and Gainesville knew as run with integrity. August's reputation was for fair dealing and straight talk and quiet reliability, and Ella's was for the kitchen garden that produced more than the family needed, and the excess of which she gave freely to anyone who came by in lean months. And for the letters, the correspondence she kept up with what seemed like half the settled territory through the postal system, which eventually included advice on soil and gardens and household management. In the autumn of 1876, Ella found herself pregnant again. She told August in the evening, sitting by the fire with Tom asleep in his room. She had debated how to tell him and then decided that direct was still best, which was always how it went with them. "There's another one coming," she said. August looked up from his book. A long pause, a slow smile, the real one. "Spring again," he said. "Spring again," she said. "You and your springs," he said. She laughed. Tom, down the hall, stirred and did not wake. "Is that all you have to say?" He set the book down, stood up, and came and crouched in front of her chair, taking both her hands in his, and he looked up at her with the face she loved best, the one that was completely his and kept nothing back. "I have a great deal more to say," he said. "I'll say it for the next 50 years. The second baby, born in March of 1877, was a girl. They named her Caroline, after his mother, who had read Keats and been unhappy for 30 years, and who deserved to have something bright and living carry her name forward into better circumstances." August held his daughter in the bedroom of the house he had built, and she gripped his finger just as her brother had, and he looked at Ella over the baby's head with an expression that was completely without walls. Tom was 22 months old and deeply ambivalent about the new development, staging a series of protests that were both transparent and somewhat impressive in their creativity. Ella handled them with patient humor. August crouched down to Tom's level one afternoon when the ambivalence was particularly vocal, and had a very serious conversation about the nature of siblings and responsibility. And Tom stared at him for a long moment after and then put his head on August's knee, which seemed to be an agreement of some kind. By summer of 1877, Tom had transferred his primary interest to his sister and would sit beside her cradle, the cedar one August had made, and narrate events to her in a stream-of-consciousness monologue that was, Ella suspected, something he had gotten from watching her talk to the horses. She told August this one evening. He looked at her with the quiet that was now comfortable, the quiet she now read correctly, the one that was warm rather than absent. "That seems right," he said. Life at the W settled into a rhythm that was full without being frantic. The daily work of the ranch and the household and the children, interrupted regularly by the particular joys and demands of a working life in 1870s Texas. There was drought in 1878 that made the summer hard and required difficult decisions about the herd, and August handled them with the methodical honesty she had come to trust entirely. There were good years and leaner ones, the way it is with land. There were illnesses that terrified and resolved. There were storms that kept them in the house for days, which became, unexpectedly, some of their best times. The closed-in coziness of a fire lit and children underfoot, and nothing to do but be with each other. She wrote letters. Every 2 weeks to Gerald and Martha, every month to Clara, every few weeks to Mrs. Perry, until Mrs. Perry died peacefully in 1879, and Ella wept for her and wrote to Mrs. Perry's daughter. She wrote to Calhoun's sister in Ohio when she heard Calhoun was poorly, and she organized a collection among the Redemption Creek households to send him to a doctor in Gainesville. He came back improved and called her Mrs. Warren with a particular gentleness for the rest of his life. In 1879, Gerald and Martha came for a second visit and brought the children who were older now and could work, and who spent 2 weeks absolutely awed by the horses and the cattle and the size of the sky. Gerald's eldest, a boy of 13, spent most of the visit following August around with his eyes open, and August showed him the work without performance or condescension, and it was one of the things Ella loved about her husband, the way he was with young people who wanted to learn. On the last night of that visit, after the children were asleep, Gerald and Martha and August and Ella sat around the kitchen table with a lamp between them, the way people sit when the time is running out and they want to make it count. "You've built something real here," Gerald said to August. "Not as a compliment exactly, or not only as a compliment, as a recognition." "We have," August said. He looked at Ella. "Both of us." Gerald looked at his sister. The look had no words in it, but she read it easily. "I am not entirely there yet" became "I am entirely there now." She smiled at him, and he smiled back, and across the table August refilled Gerald's glass and Gerald let him, which was about as clear a statement of arrival as Gerald Collins had ever been capable of making. The letters never stopped. Years later, when Tom was old enough to ask where he had come from, which children do in the absolute most literal sense at an inconvenient moment, Ella sat with him at the kitchen table, and told him about Missouri and Gerald and Martha, and the stage journey to Texas, and the advertisement in the newspaper, and arriving in Redemption Creek to find a man standing at the stage stop with his hat in his hand. Tom listened with the focused intensity of a 6-year-old who is still deciding which parts of the story are interesting. "Did you like him right away?" he asked. She thought about it. "I was curious about him right away," she said. "What's the difference?" "Liking is easy," she said. "Curious means you want to know everything." Tom considered this. "Did you?" "Eventually," she said. "It took some work." "Why?" She looked across the kitchen to where August was coming in from the yard, pausing in the doorway to take his hat off, looking at her with the particular expression that 14 months of silence had hidden, and which she had been reading clearly every day since the afternoon she sat on the porch step and waited for him to tell her the truth. "Your father," she said carefully, "is a man who keeps things on the inside until he trusts you enough to show them." Tom frowned. "Is that bad?" "Not bad," she said. "Just takes patience." August had come into the kitchen by now and was pouring himself water at the basin, and he looked at her with the lifted eyebrow that was their shorthand for, "What are you telling him?" She smiled at him. "But worth the patience?" Tom asked. "Very much worth the patience," she said. She got up to start dinner, and when she passed August at the basin, she put her hand briefly on his back, just between the shoulder blades, the way she did sometimes without needing anything from it, just to say, "I am here, and so are you, and that is everything." He put his hand over hers without turning around. He held it there a moment. The mockingbird was singing outside the kitchen window, going through its repertoire without end, and somewhere down the hall Caroline was laughing at something Tom had said to her before he wandered in to ask his questions, and the kitchen smelled like the garden, like late summer tomatoes and fresh bread and cedar from the wood box, and everything about the evening was completely ordinary and completely extraordinary and entirely, fully, her life. The box of letters sat on the shelf in the parlor. 32 of them, tied in a blue ribbon that was thoroughly frayed by now. She had never sent them in the end, not after all. She had posted the copies she made, the new versions written after everything changed, but the originals she kept. They were a record of who she had been in that first year, and of who he had been, and of the strange, hidden, frightened way he had loved her before he knew how to say it. She had forgiven it entirely. Not because she had to, or because she had run out of energy for the grievance, but because she understood it now in the full context of a man who had been raised in a house where words were either weapons or absent, who had found himself in possession of feelings larger than anything he knew how to carry, and who had made the wrong choice in the only way that had seemed possible to him at the time. It was not a defense of the wrong choice, but it was the truth of it, and they had built something in the space after it. Something real and large and daily, the kind of love that is not made of grand gestures but of small true ones. Fire built before you wake, and coffee kept warm, and cradles made by hand through winter, and letters that go and are answered. Words said out loud instead of kept inside where they press and press until they damage something. Tom grew up to be a man with a gift for horses, and a tendency towards seriousness that he wore more comfortably than his father had, having grown up in a house where seriousness was accompanied by warmth. Caroline grew up with her grandmother's name and her mother's tendency to narrate things out loud, which August found both familiar and endearing. 2 years after Caroline, in 1879, another boy came, named James, who arrived in October rather than spring, and who was from his first days the loudest person in the house by a considerable margin, and who gave no indication of ever intending to be otherwise. James was followed, in 1882, by a second daughter, Anna, who had August's dark hair and Ella's blue eyes, and who combined these inheritances with a gravity of purpose that made her, by age 3, the most formidable personality in a house that had several formidable personalities. August, with 4 children and a working ranch and a wife who talked to horses and organized postal networks and grew tomatoes in difficult soil, was a man who had arrived entirely at the life he had been terrified he did not deserve. He said so once, only once, on an evening in the summer of 1882, sitting on the porch with Ella watching the sun go down over the double W, the children all inside and audible through the window, the vast Texas sky going through its nightly business of spectacular color. "I don't know that I deserve this," he said. She looked at him. "You built most of it." "You are most of it," he said. She was quiet a moment, looking at the sky. "Deserving was never the right frame," she said. "You either tend it or you don't. You either show up or you don't. You have been showing up every day for years." "After one very bad year," he said. "After one very bad year," she agreed, "which we have discussed thoroughly and which is over." He looked at her sideways, the slight curve of his mouth that was the quieter version of the smile. "Over," he confirmed. She leaned her head on his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The sky turned red and gold and then deeper colors, the serious colors, the colors that came when the light was nearly gone and what remained was what was actually true. Inside, someone knocked something over and there was a crash and the beginning of a negotiation. August made a slight movement, the instinct to get up. "Tom has it," she said. He settled back. "You can tell from here." "I can always tell," she said. He pulled her a little closer. "I know," he said. "That has always been true of you." She smiled, her head on his shoulder, looking at the last light over the double W. All this land, which had seemed so punishing and so foreign when she stepped off the stage with her ribbon in her hair and her stubborn hope, had become the place she knew better than anywhere else, the place her children would know, the place whose particular flat beauty under a wide sky she would probably describe in letters for the rest of her life to people who could not picture it. She was still writing those letters. She would always be writing those letters. But now they were sent. Every single one. The double W settled into the early evening, the cattle somewhere out on the grass and Sargent in the corral, and the kitchen garden done for the summer. Everything in its place, everything tended. The ordinary continuous work of a life built from honesty and patience, and the courage to ask for what you need and to be present when it is given. August and Ella sat on the porch until the stars came out, which took a while in Texas where the sky is very large, and the dark has to overcome a great deal of space. And the children eventually came to the door one by one to say good night. Tom first, and then Caroline, and then James, and then Anna, who was carried out by Tom, because she had fallen asleep in the parlor, and who transferred from his shoulder to her bed without fully waking. When the house was quiet, August stood and held out his hand, and she took it, and they went inside, and he bolted the door, and she banked the kitchen fire, and they did the last ordinary tasks of the day in the way of two people who have long since stopped needing to speak to communicate the essential things. He made sure the lamp in the window was lit. It had always been lit. She had always known it was for her. She stood in the doorway of their bedroom and looked at him standing by the window with the lamp, and she thought about the first time she had arrived to find it lit, in those early months when she had not yet understood what it meant, had not yet had access to the man behind all the carefully maintained surfaces, and she thought about what she knew now that she had not known then, which was that the surface and the interior were not the same thing, and you had to be patient enough and curious enough and stubborn enough to stay until you could see both. She had been all three. "Come to bed," she said. He turned from the window and looked at her in the doorway, and his expression was everything she had ever needed to find in him, clear and direct and entirely without walls. "Yes," he said. Outside, the Texas night was immense and still, the stars doing their ancient patient work above the double W, above the grasslands and the cattle and the kitchen garden and the cedar tree where the mockingbird slept. The land stretched out in every direction, indifferent and beautiful, and somewhere on its surface was a porch where a woman had once sat in the October sun and waited for a man to tell her the truth, and a yard where he had stood with his hat in his hand and finally, at significant cost and with imperfect execution, begun to do exactly that. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the end, precisely everything.